The government has handed down its long-awaited response to the Disability Royal Commission, an inquiry that lasted 4.5 years and heard from more than 10,000 people who spoke of their experiences of abuse and neglect. The inquiry suggested ways the government could change laws and policies to improve the lives of people with disabilities after hearing it had failed to uphold their human rights in some instances. Today, we'll take you through some of the changes that have been accepted and, more importantly, what's been put on the back burner.
So, Harry, I remember there was this extremely long inquiry into the experiences of people with disabilities, and we heard some really harrowing stories. There was a lot of media interest all about this Royal Commission. Can you just give me, I guess, a bit of a high-level rundown about that Royal Commission?
Before I begin, I think it's just worth noting that I couldn't give it full justice in a single podcast episode. It lasted 4.5 years. The Royal Commission travelled right around the country and heard from approximately 10,000 people with disabilities. So that's around 10,000 stories that were heard during this time. And it was set up in 2019, and it took about 4.5 years before it could hand down its final report. COVID-19 obviously disrupted things a little bit when it came around in 2020, but ultimately it took so long because there was just so much evidence to sift through, and there were so many people telling their stories of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it's worth noting that the powers of the Royal Commission itself are quite significant.
Yeah.
So it is the highest form of inquiry that you can possibly have in Australia. And it has the powers to request information, to call on witnesses, and to consult with experts. So it does take time.
And time it did take, but then we got this Disability Royal Commission. It was really long, but it had these really rich stories of the experiences of people with disability. What did it tell us? What did it find?
The top line out of this inquiry was that people with disability suffered higher rates of violence, neglect, and abuse than the rest of the population of Australia. And this was in the form of exclusion and discrimination in sectors like housing, employment, and education. And there was also some quite shocking evidence of physical and sexual abuse, so much so that the final report accused multiple levels of government of failing to meet its international obligations to protect people with disability from human rights abuses.
And those are some really serious claims. But there was highlighting what was wrong, but then this Royal Commission also took it one step further, and it had a bunch of recommendations about what needed to change.
That's right. And that was the essence of the final report. And it came through with 222 recommendations, which I think it's not exactly a light read, but that's because it does speak to the complexity of some of the issues that we heard during the Royal Commission, and also the depth of the inquiry itself. So some of the recommendations focused on just making sure that government policy and legislation factor in the rights of people with disabilities, noting that it had fallen by the wayside before. And so, for example, it said the government has a role to play in making sure that people with disabilities have more choice when it comes to housing. So they shouldn't just be offered to stay in what's known as a group home with other people with disabilities. And I'll come back to that point because that was a pretty key recommendation, and the response was significant from the government on that one. But also on the point of housing, the recommendation said that people with disabilities need to be considered when the government's developing something like a homelessness strategy. Because right now, crisis accommodation for people fleeing domestic violence is not fully accessible in some circumstances. So they might not have adequate handrails, or might not have the bathroom facilities that someone with a disability might need. And so the recommendation said that this all needs to come into the government's thinking when it's starting to develop those plans.
And so all of those recommendations, all 222 of them, were handed down to the government in September last year. What has the response from the government been to those recommendations?
Well, the government initially promised to respond earlier this year. It has faced a bit of questioning, a little bit of criticism for taking so long to respond. But it's more than 10 months later, and we got the official response from the government yesterday. And so the federal government broke down the recommendations into two main categories. So those that fell within its powers and responsibilities, and those that fell under the scope of the states and territories. The government said 172 out of 222 recommendations were in its patch, and it accepted 13 of them and, quote, accepted in principle 117 others.
In quotations, what does that mean?
So basically, it's the government's way of saying, in quotations, we like this idea, we intend to follow through with it, but we just need to figure out how we'll do it.
Okay, so that's the in-principle stuff, and we'll get to that a bit later. But can we just first go over what the government very clearly did accept, what they said they would act on immediately?
The main thing it agreed to do was reform Australia's disabilities strategy. That's the keynote policy when it comes to the way in which the government wants to improve inclusion for people with disabilities right across Australia. It also agreed to boost the number of Auslan interpreters for people who might have difficulty with hearing. And it also wants to see better training for people wanting to become interpreters so that they can help out in more complex environments. So think healthcare or law. So in a hospital or in a court appearance, there might just be some technical language that needs a bit more interpretation. And another recommendation that the government accepted was to publish data on the prescription of antidepressants and mood stabilizer medications to people with disabilities, because the Royal Commission did hear that these kind of drugs were being overprescribed for people with cognitive disabilities.
It's really, really interesting. And so those are just a few of the recommendations that the government did accept. What about the ones that you mentioned earlier, those ones that kind of didn't make it through?
Yeah, so that leaves about 42 suggestions that'll be under further consideration or that the government has, quote, noted, meaning it won't take further action. So the main recommendation that won't change is what's known as, and I quote here, segregated settings in housing, schools and workplaces. So that's when we're thinking of specialist schools or group homes for people with disabilities. And before I get into it, I come back to that term segregated because I think it's important to note that some of the commissioners did take issue with using that word. And that's specifically when we're talking about spaces for specifically designed for people with disabilities outside the so-called mainstream. So when the final report was handed down, the commissioners were kind of split here. 3 were in favour and 4 were against a proposal to scrap what some of them called specialist and some of them called segregated education for students with disabilities. So some of them had argued that these kind of specialist schools promote separation and legitimise devaluing of people with disabilities in society and from a young age as well. So those who were defending these schools were also saying it's a way to help those people who might have more complex needs.
And where did the government fall on that?
They didn't agree to scrap it. They said that there is a place for some of these schools in Australia, and they said that it's important for, quote, providing choice for students with disabilities and their families. Now, there was also a bit of discussion about group homes, and some of the commissioners wanted them phased out within 15 years. They gave a very specific timeline on this, but the government didn't accept that. It agreed that there needs to be some reform to the way that group homes are functioning at the moment. So the government in its response said that there needs to be more opportunities for people with disabilities living in these homes to socialise and to participate in the community outside the home itself. So getting them out and, doing more activities, but also making sure that these kind of homes don't end up feeling like segregated spaces from the rest of society. Just finally, another thing that the government hasn't quite committed to yet, which was a big feature of the Royal Commission's final report, was creating a Disability Rights Act. and that was to, quote, recognise the human rights of people with disabilities. Instead, the government spruiked its own record on passing laws to improve the rights of people with disabilities. So that's like making sure that those who aren't covered under the National Disability Insurance Scheme can get more support and funding for the services that they might need.
We've spent a lot of this podcast talking about the government, how the government's thought about it, how the government's responded. And that's, of course, because when a Royal Commission is handed down, it is the role of the government to respond, adopt, reject, do whatever they like with those recommendations. However, this is an issue that goes beyond just the current government of the day. What's the reaction been like so far to how the government has responded to the Royal Commission?
So the Shadow Social Services Minister, Michael Sukkar, said that the coalition's going to be looking very closely at the government's response. As I mentioned, it's quite detailed and it does cut across state and territory politics as well as federal politics. Looking at the Greens' response, their disability rights spokesperson, Jordan Steele-John, who is the first senator to use a wheelchair, thinks the government could have gone further. He described the response as, quote, lackluster, and said that the government's not really following through what he believes is an adequate level of action, because he said that there was a bit of a desire for the government to balance the budget. So that means it's trying to focus on spending as well as responding adequately to this Royal Commission.
Always a fine balance to try and get right, and certainly one that people will be looking at the government to see what happens from here and how those recommendations that they have accepted are implemented. Thank you so much for joining the Daily Aus today. If you learnt something from today's episode, feel free to send it to a friend. It's the way more people get to listen to the Daily Aus, and we so appreciate any support you can give us. We'll be back again tomorrow, but until then, have a wonderful day.